Thank you very much for coming. The convening power of a free bacon butty in the United Kingdom is absolutely awesome at this time in the morning, so delighted to see you all here. So what I want to do today perhaps is to build upon the excellent seminar that took place yesterday. I hope some of you had the good fortune to be there. But one of the themes that came out of that, and we've got a number of colleagues from UK government and other government agencies here today, was the need really for industry and shipping and society and shipping to work much more effectively together than perhaps we had before to deal with the challenges we've got. I'm going to start though by just sort of referencing some of the things that were said yesterday because there were a number of very powerful speeches. So Ed Conway was one of the keynotes. He is the Sky News economic editor. He's written a book called Material World. And his quote was, we are more dependent on physical stuff today than we have ever been before. And it is the shipping industry, this is my bit now, that moves that physical stuff. In this case, it's Ioanna who moves that physical stuff. Nick Chakos, well known to the shipping community here in London, Dr. Nick Chakos, we must increase our efforts to make London, and by implication Newcastle, more attractive to global shipping companies. That is a plea from the shipping industry to those of you in the room who make policy. The great Arsenio Dominguez, and he really is a great Secretary General of the IMO, the shipping industry is indispensable but out of sight. Indispensable but out of sight. We shift 90% of everything. If you're in this country, it's 95% of everything. But nobody, school kids, my wife, nobody really understands what we do and how integral we are to the lifestyles and standard of living that surround us. And then I'm going to finish with the first Sea Lord, because new in post, the first ever Royal Marine, nobody is going to mess with him, trust me, the first ever Royal Marine to hold the post. And he made a number of statements. The UK, United Kingdom, is committed to the rules-based international order because it is a pillar, or the pillar, of global prosperity. And to maintain the rules-based international order, we need to work with allies. You'd expect a military man to say that. And you, industry. We need to work with industry, partner with industry in the way that we haven't done before. So those are the themes that I'm going to, with our great panel, run through today. But before I introduce them, just a few thoughts. I'm not going to go through the challenges we face. You've had 3 days of alcohol and being told what the challenges are that we face at the moment. If you saw John twitch, it's because the ship up the top there, the Sunian, I think I read an article in Tradewinds, and I think you were lying on a bed in Barcelona or on holiday in Barcelona or something when you got the call to remove a vessel that had more oil on than was spilled in the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and take it to a place of safety in an extremely hostile environment. This is what geopolitics means today. One of the comments yesterday was that, actually shipping is a really resilient industry. It is very effective for being able to adapt and to move around. But there is a tipping point. For example, if somebody stops ships going around the Cape of Good Hope, that's actually going to be quite a challenge because there's not many other routes that you can necessarily go to bring goods from east to west. If you want to get really frightened, think about 2027. Who knows what happens in 2027? In 2027, there is a theory that it is the 100th anniversary of the People's Liberation Army of China. And that is the date in which they have as a goal within which there will be Chinese unification, reunification, depends which side of the political fence you're actually on. Now, I'm not expressing any view on the politics of this because we insure people from China as much as we insure people from the United States. But think about the consequences for this industry and our global prosperity. The chips that are made in a small island called Taiwan are in every single person's mobile phone in this room, in everybody's television, in their living rooms, in every car that drives itself or doesn't even drive itself. The world will stop without those chips. And the reason it will stop without shipping is that Taiwan is wholly dependent on liquid natural gas for its power. It maintains supplies of about a week. So if you don't get one shipment in roughly per day, then you're going to find that Taiwan will have to prioritize the welfare of its society or your mobile phones. And more importantly, Russia's weapons, China's weapons, the United States' weapons, and everybody's else. That is why that is important. And that is the why in which we are impacted when things go wrong, like no other industry. So enough about geopolitics. The next ship down, ammonia, an ammonium-powered vessel, Fortescue, was moored in the Thames earlier this year. All ship owners, and Ioanna will speak to this much more eloquently than I can, will tell you about the challenge they now have in choosing what motor and what fuel to put on their new ships. 85 ships being built, I think you said? 85. So 85 times, I won't even guess what the price of the new buildings are at the moment, but 85 times whatever that is. And you have that as a 25-year asset that you're betting on, and the people who are making the policy and shaping that, some of you are in this room today. Ammonia, one observation about ammonia. There's a ship owner that I know quite well who was saying, I'm delighted. I've sourced a supply of green ammonia at $833 per metric ton. Okay. Anyone know what the price of crude is today? Around about $550 per metric ton. The calorific content of ammonia is roughly half that of fuel oil. And that green ammonia that this particular ship owner has sourced for a long-term supply comes from China. Okay? So whether we like it or not, whether we're trying to go green, whether we're just trying to trade, whether we're trying to survive, we have challenges. And then last but not least, the ship down there is not a toy, but it is a remote-controlled ship, a ship that is controlled from a little office in Southampton. So technology, what I often describe as the elephant in the room, is coming along and trying to make its presence felt in this increasingly complex world. So that's the context. I'm not going to say any more about that, because actually what we're talking about today is how we get ourselves out of this mess. So 3 questions before I introduce the panel, which I want you to have in your minds as we go through this morning. Firstly, with not through, we need to find a way in industry, and we are a traditionally very opaque, very private, very discreet industry, to work much more effectively with society and governments, not UK government, it's specifically governments and policymakers around the world. We don't project well. We like our privacy. We don't tell everybody what we do. We are, as Arsenio said, the indispensable but invisible industry. So with not through, what do I mean about that? Well, just think about sanctions, a topic most of you have heard me speak about before. The bad guys in sanctions are the Russian shipper and the Indian Chinese receiver. They're the people who decide to ship the oil at $65, $50 today and move it across from Russia to China. The people who go to prison are Jeremy, Paul, possibly myself, hopefully not, because I've got 2 really good guys in front of me, and the Greek ship owner, and the 2 bad guys continue to do whatever they're doing. That's an example, really, of how government policy is going through us. Rather than working, I think there's an opportunity to work much more collaboratively to achieve the same ends. Next thing to bear in mind, upholding the rules when they no longer exist. The First Sea Lord yesterday, we are committed to upholding the rules-based order because it is a central pillar of global prosperity. And yet, how do we do that? And this is the challenge to the shipping industry when those rules no longer work. We have one of the greatest transformations ever in our shipping industry underway as we move from oil to, I don't know what. Maybe Yana will tell us what she's thinking of moving to as a fuel source. And yet we do not have a developed, mature regulatory system yet developed, which allows us to accurately price that risk, to manage that risk, to ensure that the cost of managing that risk is cost effective for the ship owners in the room today, and there's a few of you here. So how do we uphold those rules when really we don't have rules that are suitable for the modern day world? Because actually getting them changed, getting them enacted, as we all know, takes quite a long time. And that lastly means, how do we go faster? Because whatever we're doing, we all need to be doing this at pace. We need to be moving an awful lot quicker, whether you're in policy, whether you're in society, in terms of your awareness of what's going on, whether you're in the shipping industry. So we have the the dream panel, really, to go through all these issues. So I'm going to introduce them really very briefly, because you've got the bios on the handout, but explain a little bit about where they're coming from. So Baroness Vere of Norbiton, Charlotte, delighted you could join us. Charlotte is the best form of politician. She's not in power, but she was in power. And because she's not in power, she feels free now to unburden herself and say what she actually thinks in a way that she probably couldn't if she was standing up here and talking about government policy. So Charlotte, you were shipping minister. You are now, of course, you moved. You're now in industry, working for the nuclear development company Core Power, great business. I'm sure you'll find some way to work nuclear into the conversation, but we also are very interested because Charlotte's going to give you the perspective of how difficult it is now for industry to get a new technology in place. Next, very important, Ioanna Procopiou, we have a ship owner, a ship owner from Greece, somebody who moves the gas that keeps you warm in winter, somebody that moves the fertilizer that feeds our cattle, that puts the steak on your table and stops our cows from going hungry over the winter, and somebody also who brings the oil that goes and does everything, makes plastic, that drives your car. And if there's anybody here who drives a green car and says, well, I drive a green car, I'm sorry, but they also have lubrication, they have plastics and everything else in. We are very dependent as a society on oil, and Ioanna brings it all to us. You have a new building order of 85, which is absolutely awesome, and very interested to hear what you say about the choices that you're having to make as a shipper. And I think that's really what we're really interested in hearing about, the challenges shipping faces. Next along, Dr. Samir Puri from Chatham House. Everybody has heard of Chatham House. You are the director of the new Security and Resilience Centre. I think I've got that right. We're very pleased to have Samir. Do link into him and follow him. He is one of the most erudite and influential voices going on, I think, in the foreign policy sphere today. So absolutely delighted to have you here, Samir. And then last, and absolutely no means least, we have our second ship owner, John Thompson. John works for a company called Ambrey, the founder of a company called Ambrey. We first came across John back in 2010 when North, as it then was vetting armed maritime security providers really to see which ones were doing it right. And 90% of them were not doing it right, except for John, who has always upheld the highest standards. And I think that's probably why you're still around. You've evolved your company. I'm not even going to try and describe all the things you do these days, but suffice it to say that when the Sudan needed to be moved in a really complex environment, which really did require engagement with industry and government, John's company was the business that got the job and did it extremely successfully. I did warn our underwriters when they said, hey, we've got this really good business called Ambrey. I said, do you know what Ambrey actually do? And they said, yeah, we know what they actually do. They do what? But you're innovating all the time, aren't you? So really quite good. Very, very good. Right, okay, so we're going to go through those three big questions I posed to you, with, not through. How do we uphold the rules when the rules don't work, and how do we faster? So Samir, I think we need some context to sort of kick us off here. Shipping is being used as an instrument of foreign policy and decarbonisation in a way that we're not entirely comfortable with, really. And I think whether it's sanctions or it's the emissions trading scheme, which is pricing fuels for us, can you give us a bit of context? How has shipping found itself, this really private industry that likes getting on doing its own thing without sort of making a fuss about it? How have we found ourselves in this position? And then a bit more, how do you think it's going to evolve, really?
Absolutely. Well, Mike, thanks very much for having me, and to NorthStandard for the kind invitation. In terms of context, I don't come from a maritime expert background, but I did spend nearly 5 years in Singapore, and you can't live in Singapore without being very, very aware of how critical shipping is to the sinews of globalization in the everyday life. So I really take your point. It's an unseen but vital industry. How does shipping end up in this position of being buffeted by so many different sort of crosswinds and storms at the same time? I think it's a lot about coincidence and a number of very rapid transitions happening in the world today. And the three that I discern shipping is just very exposed to is the energy transformation, as you described, clearly the onset of unprecedented levels of technological advancement around AI automation, which you've also mentioned, and the geopolitical change. And I'm going to provide some context on the third one, the geopolitics, as befits someone coming from Chatham House, my own background working in the Foreign Office, including a period of time in Donbass in East Ukraine in the first Russian invasion in 2014, and as mentioned, nearly 5 years in Asia Pacific. So very much got a global view rather than of one particular theatre. And I think what's really useful to understand, with a bit of history thrown in, especially all of the maritime expertise here, will very clearly, I think, understand when Xi Jinping, and I'm going to quote him here, uses that phrase, great changes unseen in a century. Some of you might have heard that phrase. He uses it sometimes when he's talking to Vladimir Putin, when Putin comes to visit Beijing. They sort of shake hands warmly and they sort of pat each other on the back and devise whatever schemes that they want to devise. But that phrase, great changes unseen in a century, it's not Xi Jinping's. It comes from a Chinese academic from a few years ago. It is not just guff. And I'm just going to reflect on that phrase to maybe put this sort of big picture context here. It is not only about, can I invade Taiwan? Can Vladimir Putin get away with invading Ukraine? Those are some of the symptoms. If you're living outside of the West, one of the things that you're very, very keenly aware of is it's not just the era of US-led globalization that we've all lived through, and we're arguably seeing challenged now in a very new way. That comes off the back of a couple of centuries of European-led maritime exploration, trading, colonial networks that, of course, set up an enormous amount of globalization in its sort of prehistoric form that evolved into what we have today. And it's the awareness, if you're sitting in some parts of the world, this is not my views, but if you're sitting in some parts of the world, definitely in Beijing, that we've got 3 to 4 centuries of global domination, control, rule setting, whether for the better or for the worst, being determined either by Europeans or by the broader Western world as it evolved into across the 19th to 20th centuries, and that era is now challenged and it's coming to an end. Just a couple of other observations, again, at the very big picture level, and then maybe 1 or 2 implications for shipping just to kick us off. I wrote a book last year called Westlessness, The Great Global Rebalancing, not about America's going to be replaced because China and America are in a 2-horse race. Like, very honestly, if you're doing your longer-term planning, it's about a rebalancing of power and influence emanating from several centers of the world, and novelly not actually restricted to the West. A couple of observations I sort of found when I was researching the book. One on demographics, really interesting to get our minds thinking about the extent of change. As recently as 1950, 28% of all of humanity lived in a Western country, in terms of Europe, North America, Australia, sort of geopolitically Western. In 2050, that's projected to be 12%. So I'll just give you that one statistic, and then we obviously know the G7 as an economy, collection of economies, was 65% of the global economy. As recently as 2000, that is headed to south of 50%. And so you see in things like the Russian ability to not evade sanctions, but to persist with the war despite the EU G7 sanctions. It's because the Russians have correctly read this global rebalancing. I think it's nothing more, they misread the invasion, obviously. There's nothing more than I think that Russia is in Asia, and maybe it was a little bit more attuned with Vladivostok and places like that as to how the changing balance of economic power in the world meant that as long as you get India, China, but also Indonesia and others to continue trading with you, and Turkey to some extent, the assumptions made in this part of the world about the crippling impact of sanctions may not be met. But let me round off with a couple of implications for shipping specifically. A really, really critical industry. I'd say in many respects it's at the very front line, the tip of the spear, in terms of experiencing these changes, but in the responsible response and reaction to those changes. One of which is an implication of what I'm saying is our phrase, the rules-based international order, which I have no problem with, has, by the way, evolved from being the liberal international order from about a decade or 2 ago, when I think there was a realization that some of the countries who want to be rules upholders are not necessarily domestically liberal in their constitution. Think about the Gulf countries. So there's already a sense that we need to obviously moderate the language. The other point there is that the conglomerations of countries that may have an idea that they want to be invested in these rules will be doing so from very different domestic political systems, different cultural start points. There's a phrase we have at Chatham House, and some of the work we're doing is rules without values. Not because I have no values myself, but Donald Trump as well, not a man who puts moral values at the forefront of his sort of articulation, but also the Saudi Arabias, the Gulf states, others as well. It's the idea that there's a technocratic need for maintaining rules and finding those coalitions, but some of the language and the way the rules were sold, which was quite a liberal, democratic sort of vernacular that was used, that we're quite accustomed to in this part of the world will still have traction for us and for our closest allies in the EU. It'll still work with Japan, but it won't necessarily work across all of the coalitions that we want to build to maintain and defend rules in a maybe more pragmatic way in a very challenged environment. Second observation is I think we're starting to get beyond the atrociously simplistic diagnosis. This is a new Cold War. Terrible because it means that countries will choose one side or the other. There will be some sort of division line. And in some cases that will be true. But remember, in the first Cold War, in the mid-1940s, much of the rest of the world, in Asia, in Africa, Middle East, there were still colonies. So imagine how they interpret the notion this is a new Cold War. The Indonesians will think, well, between 1945 and 49, the Dutch were trying to recolonize Indonesia. So, we didn't really have any autonomy at the start of that Cold War. We do now, because we have this great trading relationship with the Chinese around nickel. And we also have clubs like the BRICS, which Indonesia, as you know, joined a year ago. I don't think BRICS is the be-all and end-all. It's not going to replace or mirror NATO, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand what functions it does serve in terms of empowering countries that want to build trading networks that sit apart from maybe where rules and sanctions are being administered. And I think India is the obvious case in point. I won't go into India in a lot of detail. But to bring all that into sort of a closing observation, then we can, obviously deal with some of these themes a bit further down the line. The amount of change that we're going to experience over the next few decades is going to be a composite of these three. There's other lines of change, but the energy transition, the rapidity of technological change, and I would take Xi Jinping point seriously. The great changes that have not been seen in centuries in geopolitics that aren't really going to go into reverse. It doesn't mean that the West is going to be eclipsed, that the US is going to be beaten. It just means that there's going to be quite a premium on the analysis and the sort of the forward planning around dealing with a very, very complex, very, very sort of mixed up set of circumstances and trend lines and environments. So let me pause there.
Yeah.
And we can come back to that.
I always think, don't take this the wrong way, but I always think geopolitics is a bit like children in the sense that you're looking at a child who's now 10, but you'll still think they're about 5 years old. You're always behind your kids, aren't you? A lot of you parents know that you always underestimate where they got to. On that note, not necessarily the perfect segue, Charlotte, I'd like to come to you next, really, because I'll do my best. Right, so new low-carbon technologies such as nuclear. I know you want to talk about nuclear, but I think what is really interesting here is that within the context that Samir so eloquently outlined, because that is the world we are working in and you are moving into as well. You're often held back perhaps by lack of regulation, lack of understanding, by yesterday's understanding of a world, and really you're moving into a vacuum with a technology which we all accept is controversial. You and I and a lot of people in this room think it is a really good answer to the world's problems, but we've got a lot of views, rules and things to shift. So really from your perspective, both on the government side and then you're now as somebody in industry, what and taking to account the world the picture that's being painted, which I absolutely agree with from Samir. What observations might you have about how you can achieve your current business goals and move society and government with you more quickly?
Thank you so much, Mike. That question, I could literally go on for about half an hour, but I get told yes, I shan't. But I do want to talk about the government side of things, because it was very interesting to hear what Samir says. So he's gone from the biggest picture. Now, I was a government minister for 8 years, so I understand how government works, or the UK government, and have seen other governments at quite close quarters. And one often hears as a minister, oh, you just don't understand me, And it's like, sometimes I just want to just go like this and say, well, explain yourself better. I cannot even begin to tell you how many different asks you get as a government minister. So, first of all, the private sector has to recognise that it is used to deliver government priorities. 'Twas ever thus in every country in the entire world. So sometimes you will feel pushed around by that. However, sometimes, for example, I have sat in many COBRA meetings and there has been a crisis in the world somewhere, and the call is, right, do we tell the private sector? We can't. You haven't got security clearance. So there's things that will happen that you think, well, they didn't tell us about that, was terrible, and that's absolutely, a viable thing that governments have to do. But on the other side, there are things that happen, well, they didn't tell about that. Well, tell us about that. Well, why didn't you talk to us more? When I became Maritime Minister, I lifted up the weighty tome that is Maritime 2050. 138 recommendations in there, co-written by industry and government. Some of the recommendations were, we commit to start to launch a thing maybe next year. What does that mean? God. So I then spent my summer holiday going through it and trying to figure out what the maritime industry priorities were, because they hadn't been able to share them with government to come up with some pithy 8 key points to do for maritime. So my number one ask is sort your lives out. Figure out what you want government to do. And look, I was a rule maker and now I'm a rule taker. And yes, I work in nuclear for industry. You've heard a lot about nuclear for maritime. You've heard a lot about that over Shipping Week, so I won't blither on about it too much. But what I will say is that we are developing absolute clarity about what our asks are. We know what needs to change, and now we are setting about changing that. We have had numerous discussions with the US and the UK about what needs to change and how we may have to start with bilateral agreements. And there is a document going out today in which somewhere it may say something positive that helps my industry. That is great. Those are the sorts of things that one needs to do. You've got to be targeted, you've got to know your asks, and then you've got to make sure that people understand why those asks are important to them. So you do not go into the White House and go, yay, maritime decarb. The White House will throw you out. At the IMO yesterday, I listened to a speech about decarbonisation that should probably have been delivered 5 years ago. It was guff and fluff and fluffy bunnies and rainbows. It's like, we have to decarbonise, it's the right thing to do. Yeah, it's not going to work anymore. It's really not. You have to follow the priorities of the governments that you're working with. Why does the US want nuclear for maritime? Why are they so keen on it? Shipbuilding. There is only one way you are going to beat China, and that is to come up with a completely new technology to leapfrog over. You ain't going to build ships cheaper than China. You can build a whole different technology. Oh, by the way, and you're quite good at nuclear. That you can do better than China. Work with the government, not against them. Tell them what you want, and you will succeed.
Excellent. Right. Well, that's the gauntlet thrown down to our ship owner colleagues here. Ioanna, I will go to you first, then you, John, because you have a particular, your engagement with government, I think, is going to be quite interesting. But Ioanna, there you go. What a platform. What do you want? No more than 8, I think it was, Charlotte. Was 4. So if you had to sort of sit down, well, and I think, I mean, you're a board member of the Union of Greek Ship Owners, president designate of BIMCO. You're moving from a traditional ship owning background into a more political role. So if you, what examples do you have where you think industry and government have worked well? There's a few government people in the room, so you can say what you want as well. So over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everyone. Excellent points made by my co-panelists here. What I can say from my side is that regulation can make an industry flourish, or it can actually destroy any industry if it's bad regulation. And we've seen this with shipping in the US. They've actually destroyed their own shipping industry, which is costing the taxpayer a lot of money to have whatever they're having. So how do we want regulation, and why don't we have specific, I'm going back to Charlotte's question. Our industry is very fragmented, and I think that different people have different ideas. They read the numbers differently, and we've also always had a very low profile. So that hasn't helped our cause going forward. How should regulation be? Regulation should be global. It should have a proven benefit, which at the moment it's just a lot of talk and no proven benefits. It should have a long-term horizon, because as you said, Mike, the life of a ship from the time that you contract it until it's delivered is about 3 years plus a 25-year life of the vessel. So we're talking about 28 years of stable regulation that you need in order to make these huge investments that we are all making in order to modernize and make our ships more efficient, etc. And at the moment, in the past, let's talk about the past a little bit. You used to have the technological breakthrough, then you had the time to test it, then you had the time to implement it, and then regulation would be drawn. Because of the climate emergency, we are found in a situation where regulation is being formed with absolutely no technological breakthroughs, no idea of complying, and you have a lot of politicians that are very happy to make those fantastic headline news and say, yes, we're putting the ambition here. No, then we're going to put it even further and further. And that's what we've been seeing, more ambitious every MEPC, every IMO meeting, every, anyhow, many of those conventions that are taking place. And there's no means of complying. But what I want to say in the defense of shipping is that shipping is essential for energy and food security. It is 60 times more fuel efficient than air transport and 20 times more efficient than land transport. For some countries, it's the only way that they can connect to the rest of the world, so it's essential for their connectivity and for selling their goods. And in order to have efficient and helpful regulation, we need to have the whole range of the stakeholders to cooperate, to have any meaningful emissions reduction, any environmental regulations. It's not just the ships, it's the engine manufacturers, it's the shipyards, it's the shippers of the cargo, it's the receivers, it's the port facilities, it's the bunker infrastructure, it's the fuel that should be supplied. So you need a whole range of people in order to be able to have this efficient regulation that should work together. And yes, Charlotte, as you said, it's very important to have specific targets and specific asks, but it's not always very easy to come up with what these are.
I'm going to come, just before I let you go and come to John, I just wanted to, I was very taken by something you said in Athens where I caught you unawares and you foolishly agreed to sort of come across to this event, which we're very grateful for. But you said there, we don't really have much choice. We're just going to pay to pollute because there is no broader infrastructure around it there. We'll run more. You were the first person I ever heard to say, if you want to cut emissions, just steam slower. Before everybody else was saying it, that was the first place I actually heard it was from you. But what I think, are we just a question for you really, because Greece is much more attuned to sort of global shipping perhaps than historically, this country is today. Do you think we are being honest with society about the cost of maritime decarbonisation? And I ask you that because, if there is no alternative to fuel for a lot of the trade, for oil in the short, medium term, for a lot of the trades that you do, then ultimately the cost that you take on, because there is nothing else, so you're just going to have to pay a premium to use oil to bring soybeans from Brazil into Europe, is going to move on to the consumer. It's going to move into the farm prices for the fertilizer, and the cost of maritime green transition is what globally 1.9 trillion. You hear lots and lots of figures, don't you? But that's probably as good an estimate as ever. I think Shell said 1.6 trillion a couple of years ago. Are we being honest? Are we being honest? Are we as a society aware that means your beef's going to cost more because the fertilizer to feed, or the feedstock to feed your animals in the winter is costing more because it comes from Brazil on board your ship, which had to pay a premium because it's got no choice but to use fuel?
Mike, I don't think it's just a question of how much it's going to cost. It's a matter of availability, because by making something expensive, the concept is that you're making the alternative cheaper, so you go for the greener choice. At the moment, there's no such thing. I can give you some numbers, which I think that's what you're referring to. And when we're saying greener, we have to look at the whole life cycle analysis of fuel. It's not just from tank to wake, which is it should be from well to wake. So it's from the time that you start producing fuel. So at the moment, if we were to decarbonize our industry, we would need 440 million tons of methanol, green methanol. At the moment, we have 3.2. We would need 470 million tons of ammonia. At the moment, we have 6.4. We would need 180 million tons of green LNG. At the moment, we have 0.01. And we would need 70 million tons of hydrogen. And at the moment, we have 1.5. And we have to bear in mind that it's not just our industry decarbonizing. Yeah. It's all the land-based industries. And a lot of this supply has been already committed to land-based industries.
Yeah.
So we're talking about an impossible task. That's why I said you're going to be paying to pollute because there's absolutely no other option.
Yeah, I know.
And it's a shame because we're putting the environment as a headline, and at the end of the day, to me, it's a tax collecting mechanism. And then we can talk about it at a later stage in our discussion, but how is the money going to be distributed? What's the governance?
Yeah, and ultimately, when shipping costs go up, we pay for it on the shelves. We all do.
And who's going to pay for it?
Well, right, John, you have a particular unique insight into the interface between government and industry, because, no pun intended, very much on the cutting edge in terms of stretching probably the frameworks within which you're operating. I'm really interested to hear, because I do want this conference to be positive, about where you think government and industry have worked well together, and with all the problems you just heard about, actually what we can achieve if we sort of get it right.
In amongst the doom and gloom, you mean? Yeah, absolutely. So Ambrey as a business really do sit between government and industry. We're almost in that space where military reach ends, but private sector needs security support. So the limits of defence, that's where we end up being. And actually, interestingly, companies like ours have grown in the last couple of decades because those gaps are increasingly apparent. Militaries are stretched, priorities are many. The complex world we've been discussing mean that there's only so many warships, and they're going to be in so many places at once. So that's how we sit now, supporting largely commercial shipping. I think before I get to the good news story, I think what I see every day, and my role in the business has been to talk to the ship owners. Ultimately, I'm the sort of chief client-facing part of it, so I've got a good view on the global fleets and a cross-sector view on what they're experiencing. And I think for the last sort of 35 years or so, probably since the end of the tanker wars of the 1980s, international shipping has been able to trade the international shipping lanes largely unimpeded. Safe and secure, with international military and naval support largely. And with, of course, the kind of geopolitical winds of change that have always buffeted shipping, able to cope. What you've seen in the last 5 or 6 years that's made shipping deeply uncomfortable, and governments, has been low-cost technology that can reach out and touch ships in a way it never could before. And drone technology, unmanned surface vessels. A good example of that, obviously, is Ukraine in the Black Sea, of some 25 plus of the Black Sea fleet, and conducted effectively a brilliant sea denial operation with Western military support against the Russian fleet. But the shoe's been on the other foot for example, in the Red Sea, where the Houthis, with Iranian backing, have been able to reach out and conduct just as effective a sea denial operation against Israeli-affiliated shipping in the Red Sea using very similar technology. And the cost of that technology is very low. When you're shooting a missile at a drone, and the missile costs $2 million and the drone costs $80,000, there's a huge imbalance, and many of you will be aware of that. So that's where shipping sits today, and those are the problems we're trying to help shipping solve. It can be done well. So go back to the sort of where's the hope? Go back about 15 years, and actually where Mike and I first got to know each other was NorthStandard employed a professional firm, an independent firm, to vet the maritime security sector at that time, and the providers of armed security. And that for those who aren't aware, Somali piracy had sort of really blown up in about 2008, 2009. Shipping had quite rightly demanded a solution because ships were being hijacked almost every week. A huge number of seafarers were being held for months at a time in Somalia. And it was a travesty on a number of levels. North had looked across the sort of plethora of startup companies that had appeared, that were saying they could provide armed security, the different standards that were out there, and started a vetting program. And as Mike said at the beginning, 90% of the companies in that program failed. There was no standard for armed security on ships. Stepped forward the UK government, actually, at that time, and they amended the UK export control legislation to allow UK security companies to export UK firearms into the Indian Ocean to provide a kind of regulated, a controlled anti-proliferation environment where we could provide the right equipment to the right people, properly trained. And actually, very, very quickly, what we saw was that peak of Somali piracy tapered off and has been effectively suppressed ever since. And that was paid for by shipping. That was a brilliant kind of government, private sector solution at the time. And I think, BIMCO stepped forward with a GuardCon, which dealt with the contractual side of it. And actually, the city here, City of London, the war risk underwriters were putting in place the warranties for armed guards on ships on war risk policies, which was the right thing to do, and had their own vetting lists as well of companies. So they had approved standard companies that they would approve to discount their war risk premiums and provide cover to ships and allow them to sail safely through the Indian Ocean. So, a great solution. I can talk about how it's evolved, perhaps in the next phase.
Okay.
As we moved into that kind of higher technology era, and as things like piracy have evolved.
One. I don't want to let you go just yet, because one question then. I mean, because you can draw a parallel between what you were doing then with what we're having a much greater scale to do now. We're having to move into an area which is unregulated as an industry, a society, as government. And, I can very much imagine you racing around lots of offices in London City and everything else, doing that individual lobbying, saying, we need to be able to get our guns legally from Hereford, wherever it was, down to the ships in the Gulf of Aden. So, is it that level of just sort of micro lobbying, or do you need help? Do you need allies or industry? What I mean?
You need help. I mean, because we're in London, let's talk about London. I think a huge amount comes from the insurance sector. All risk underwriters write these warranties into policies, and the person buying that policy has to abide by them. Otherwise, they're buying a worthless piece of paper, effectively. So I think the insurance sector needs to be alive to that challenge and change and demand the right level of risk mitigation. We've seen in the last couple of months, the Magic Seas and the Eternity Sea were both sunk in the Red Sea. A number of seafarers drowned. In fact, it was an Ambrey operation that was the only vessel in the Red Sea that rescued those seafarers that got in the water, because there were no other ships around and there were no warships, because the warships had been retasked to other areas. So we've got to demand the right standards, and for me it starts in the city. It really does. It starts with the insurance sector, because they actually unknowingly really guide the whole thing. And then of course ship owners, because I think, as Yana said, Somali piracy was solved because ship owners demanded a solution and worked very, very hard, and all the different associations that support the ship owners demanded the same, and so almost spoke with one voice, and that worked very, very. Over a period of 1 to 2 years, the right solutions came in, and it solved that problem. Okay. So it's about doing this, about talking about it, but about, I think, individual accountability as well. Companies going, hang on a minute, who are we vetting? Who is doing this? What standard do we require? Let's insist on it. And perhaps some of those commercial pressures that often come in the insurance sector to write this bit of business, they've got to ask the hard questions and stand up and be counted.
Thank you. Well, thanks. That was the only gambit. But, you are a hand-picked audience, okay? You're here to do some work. We do want some feedback from you. So I did try it. So even those of you at the back, if you expand your phones, you should be able to sort of link onto that QR code and open up Slido, please. And then I want some answers from you. It's a very straightforward question, but I think it'll just be insightful and help the panel sort of move on to the next stage. So I'll just give you a moment or two to whisk out your Taiwan chipped phones, point them at the screen, open up Slido. If anybody answers absolutely spiffing, you will be asked to justify why you're so optimistic when you get to the questions. Have we all done that? So how would you best summarize the relationship between the shipping industry, the societies that it serves, and those who make shipping policy? And when you press the button and then put send, we should see whether anybody is an optimist. Could do better. Okay. It was distorted as this. Could do better. A lot of work to do. Was nobody gone? There must be somebody who thought we're doing absolutely brilliantly. Come on, whoops, government, Graham. The international group, I can see you, don't hide. Okay, where have we got to? Well, I think, that's interesting, because this is not a normal NorthStandard audience. I guess those of you on government are saying we've never seen these people before, and vice versa, the you from the shipping industry. We did try very hard to get quite a mix in this audience, really, just to see what where you all got to. But I think that, we've got some consensus, haven't we? We all recognise in this room that actually there's a lot of work to do to sort of make industry and government work a little bit more effectively together. About right, okay. But I think the majority there thinks, there is work to do. The mergers between could do better and there is a lot of work to do. I think if I was putting that, I'd say I think that we could do better. I certainly don't think it's absolutely spiffing. Thanks. Okay, so there we go, panel. We're going to go on to the big theme 2 now, which is really how do we uphold the rules, which I know is really precious to shipping when the rules don't really cover the situations in front of us. So, Ioanna, I'm going to start with you. Something that we feel really proud of in the shipping industry, something that we always make a plea for, is IMO legislation. So maybe from the ship owner then, really, how important is IMO to ship owners in enabling the global trades that you do? And what do we need to do collectively as ship owners, government, society to make sure that it maintains its relevance in this new world that Samir was talking about a few moments ago?
First of all, we have to be very grateful to IMO and everything it's done since 1948. It has made some very important conventions like SOLAS, which is safety of life at sea, MARPOL, which is for maritime pollution, STCW standards, which is for our crew. So they have managed to maintain and to lift the standard of safety and ensure that things are done to the biggest, at least as a minimum, to have a very good base, and you can do better than that. Another thing that's very important with IMO is that it's a global body. So because shipping is international, it doesn't have a base. It has ships that move around the world, especially tramp shipping, which is not even they can go anywhere in the globe. It's important to have an international maritime organization that helps with global regulations. So now, though, we're in the stage where the IMO is trying to put the standards for the decarbonization, and we're seeing very ambitious goals that, as we discussed earlier, we're not going to be able to comply with as an industry. And the sums of money that we're going to be collecting, they're starting this global fuel standard, and in 2028, it's estimated that they're going to be raising between 15 and 30 billion, and this is going to gradually go quite steeply up, and it's estimated that by 2035 it's going to be 100 billion, and this is comparable to the GDP of countries. I don't know what sort of experience IMO has in handling money. I don't know where the money is going to go, how they're going to encourage technological change. Because as we're talking about regulations and stability, what we see, for example, I'll give an example, LNG. LNG is a transitional fuel. It has a lower footprint than fuel oil, but it's not perfect. It has its shortcomings, etc. And at the moment, with the new regulations that have been set forward, we see that there's a penalization of LNG. A lot of people, though, wanting to be pioneers or early adopters, decided to make this investment into their ships and have dual fuel burning ships. And what sort of signal does that give to those that were early adopters and wanted to be compliant by actually penalizing this fuel, which with its shortcomings is a transitional fuel? And just to note that it's not just the fuel, it's also the infrastructure that you need, because by being a global industry, you have to be able to bunker, to take fuel on board in different ports around the world. And it has taken 40 years to develop LNG infrastructure. Yeah. So now what we're being asked is, okay, scrap LNG, scrap fuel oil. We're going to have these alternative fuels that are not available. It cannot be produced. I'm not even going to talk about the price of what these alternative fuels and the energy content, because at least fuel oil is much more dense in energy. So you need less quantity for the same distance, let's say. So what we're being asked now is to scrap all of that and have alternative fuels. But how am I going to travel around the globe if I don't have the option to bunker the ship along the way, in Africa, in Asia, in Australia? Even with LNG, you don't even have bunkering stations all around the globe. So we are faced with a big dilemma when it comes to all of these regulations and IMO as well, because you wanna give a long-term horizon, as we were saying earlier, and I think we're not getting to that.
And if I did have a plea to those of you from government here, there's a really good initiative from the International Chamber of Shipping called CEM Hubs, Clean Energy Ministerial Hubs, and it addresses exactly that point. It is a toolkit to help states develop the necessary infrastructure to support ships using these new fuels. Because as Ioanna said, you either need a bigger tank or you need to fill up a lot more frequently. And if you're sailing from Brazil to Rotterdam, to South Africa, to China, to Australia, to Indonesia, to Brazil, you're simply not there. This is an initiative. It's gaining credence. It's been led by Canada, I think, and it's interesting the states that are starting to subscribe to that. So that is a really good ICS ship owner-led initiative, which is really trying to address your need to have, forgive the wrong allegory, petrol stations all dotted around the world for whatever fuel you're actually using. Samir, you next. The rules-based order in existence since World War II. Do you think, and try and be optimistic, do you think it really can survive, in this new world that you sort of outlined right at the start? And I'm going to come to you because I did tip you off the other day and talk about, I forgot what the word is now, multipolarity, later on, whether there is some sort of compromise solution in the middle. So, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it won't have escaped anyone's attention that this year was the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, but also the formation of the UN and the San Francisco Charter signed up and then sort of enacted in October 1945. So a lot of our global rules are showing their age. It's very interesting to hear about UNCLOS, though, because just in terms of the family of organizations that came about in the 40s, in terms of global governance, that phrase that is now quite embattled because of the geopolitical fissures. So there's the obvious example people give is the UN Security Council is paralyzed into inaction because Russia and China are taking different sides on issues. The US is using the council to back Israel as well on some cases. So the fissures and fractures going in all directions. I'd say as a general principle, the more technocratic the governance structure is, the likelier it has a healthier future. So I think to the extent that UNCLOS and some of the laws of the sea and rules of shipping actually have quite a technocratic focus that allows them to maybe skirt away from some of the unavoidable geopolitical fissures, that's actually potentially quite positive. I'm going to challenge it, though, with one very clear example in terms of the way governance and global rules are being reshaped by the reshaping of global order. Totally different example. The rules around UN peacekeeping missions are now showing a greater imprint of Chinese influence because there are more Chinese officials in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations in the UN in New York. So things like the human rights rules of the rules of engagement for a peacekeeping mission, there might be a part on human rights which is maybe being modified and coming away. Now, I think depending on the rules that you're particularly interested in, there was an incident 10 years ago where World Intellectual Property Organization was about to be headed by a Chinese nominee. The US is a different era. The US corralled enough support and got a Singaporean to head World International Property Organization in Geneva instead. Understandably, with the concern around China and IP theft, that was considered to be quite a success. We're not necessarily in the position now, I think, of holding back the tidal waves. It's a bit of a King Canute situation where I think eventually there's going to be a different imprint from different parts of the world, BRICS countries, Gulf countries, China, India, Indonesia, further down the line, in some of these global rules. And I think maybe some of the thinking now as to how those changes will start to influence these rules, whether it's on the implementation of the rules, whether it's actually arguing that certain conventions are now 80 years, 100 years old, we need to actually replace them, supplement them. Who will actually be a signatory? Who will be a pen holder as that process takes root? No answers there, but I think, again, another sort of view into the future.
I mean, so I found the word that I was searching for. I mean, shipping, the global shipping industry, absolutely believes in, it's almost molded into our DNA, a sort of multilateral IMO-based system of governance, because that creates a level playing field, reduces barriers to trade, does all the good things. Governments now challenged because they can't update the system. So if some ship, I mean, the great example is the I don't know, Ioanna, you were saying, well, no, this convention you've dug out from the 19th century. But if you're a government and you've got a critical subsea cable, there is a convention that was 1886, I think, that was designed for the protection of critical subsea infrastructure. And the way it worked was that the signatory states, Russia, the UK, the UK, the Royal Navy would see this ship sailing along with its anchor dragging along over a vital cable. The Royal Navy would board the ship, the captain would go on board, collect evidence, put it in a nice little envelope and send it across to the Russians and say, here you are, could you just prosecute your ship owner for pulling up a critical piece of subsea infrastructure? That, no surprises, doesn't work in today's world. So you can understand the need, given how dependent we are on some of this stuff for government to find ways to protect that infrastructure. The word I was looking for, because it was used in the context of how do we keep the WTO relevant and modern in a very similar parallels to the IMO, was plurilateral. Whether there is some sort of hybrid that upholds the rules-based order, that can sit within the framework of something like IMO, but is still a more modern way of being able to deal with the problems that governments and shipping have today.
Yeah, and it's really on that point about hybridity, because I think the idea that everything's going to collapse or be replaced by something else is really wrong. And it's about a different blend going into the future in terms of the influences on governance, possibly different combinations of rules. And one quick point of evidence on this. So the Chinese, they had their Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Ambrey, about 2-3 weeks ago, and they got all these world leaders, 20+ world leaders. Xi Jinping used the opportunity to launch China's Global Governance Initiative. Doesn't have a lot of detail around it, but the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi followed that up quite quickly with a real doubling down on China's support for the UN system. So that's what the Chinese keep saying, is that we don't like things like NATO, we don't like US unilateralism, but we like the UN system. Now, there's a little bit of, walk the walk here. So if that's the case, is the Global Governance Initiative from China going to suggest modifications inside of the UN system? Is it going to suggest alternatives among its own sort of club of Belt and Road Initiative economic partners? We're at the cusp. We don't know is the answer. Yeah. But I think we're at the cusp now of being able to plot out the next 10, 15, 20 years of what change might look like in the global governance arena. And it's quite interesting. It's very different to the global security arena, which is pretty pyrotechnic, with lots of events, lots of wars. Global governance, it's a bit like watching paint dry, arguably. It's rules and people in boardrooms, with charters, and technocratic, very legalistic. But I think it is going to be no less a critical theatre of action. Yeah. It's just that monitoring that action and making sensible decisions and policy investments at this stage, and working out who your partners are to make your case more strongly within those corridors of power, to either back rules that you like that already exist, and just closing comment, I love the undersea cable vintage here, the treaty. Obviously, that's right in the middle of China's century of humiliation, between the Opium Wars and the Chinese Communist Party coming in. So it probably doesn't have a great vintage for people in Beijing. But at the same time, they also have a need to have rules in order to function. And there's no indication the Chinese want to replace the US point about, basing and security globally. That comes from the US global deployment structure in Bahrain and elsewhere. That is, of course, it builds on a legacy of the British and the French and the others from centuries ago. So again, we're at the cusp of seeing whether there's a desire from the Chinese and their security partners not to replace it globally, but to maybe replace it in certain areas. And I think that is another version of a blended reality that we're at the cusp of. If you think about sort of Russia's Pacific coast with North Korea, China, and Russia, that's likely to be more of their domain going into the future.
Good. I'm going to come to you, John, then Charlotte. I'm going to ask Charlotte, just give you prep time, really. How we can work with partner nations from your experience, really, to sort of get things moving a little bit faster. But John, paint drying for new legislation to deal with your drones and the rapidly evolving threats. I mean, some of the ways which the rules don't really keep pace. How do we get them? How do we get things moving more quickly in this? In a world that my colleague Sarah McCann went down to Plymouth recently, and the comment there from the really clever people, not like me, a simple lawyer, the really clever people involved in AI and so on, was the regulation is out of date by the time it comes into place for the sort of stuff we're doing. So how do we your experience of new tech coming in, new challenges, the regulations lagging behind, and any sort of insight you can offer on that?
I suppose, again, 'twas never thus. As Charlotte said earlier, I think governments always lag behind. I think certainly at a practical level, what we're feeling in the security space at the moment is that distance is getting greater and greater and greater, and it really isn't keeping up. And even if you just look at the last few weeks of kind of global security or geopolitical events and how fast they've happened and what do they actually mean, you've obviously had political assassination in the US. That's not a new thing, but it happened and it was a big one. You had cartels being hit by airstrikes off Venezuela.
That's a very quick regulation, wasn't it?
Yeah, I know. You've had Israel bombing Qatar, and so that's even the last couple of weeks. So as this kind of this rebalancing of power, this multipolar world is playing out. It's happening faster and faster and faster. We go back to my earlier good example of UK government legislation that came in with piracy. What you had there was consensus. And when you get consensus, things can move really quite quickly for government. I think all of that was done within 12 to 18 months, which is pretty good. What you have at the moment is a complete lack of consensus, I think. And actually, because of that, government is really grappling and is dealing with a lot of noise, a huge amount of noise. I mean, we all are. And digitally, there's so much going on in the world that's making things faster. How do you cut through that? How do you work out what's really happening? How do you work out even what your own nation state is considering a priority, is let alone kind of an international level? And we are practically feeling it. The export control legislation that was brilliantly brought in for piracy to control UK firearms was built all around piracy and the use of firearms against the piracy threat. The development of unmanned surface vessels in the Red Sea, which we saw in the last couple of years from the Houthis, which has sunk, I think, 3 or 4 ships now. Armed security can counter that, and Ambrey has destroyed unmanned surface vessels with UK firearms and licensed firearms, but that's under a piracy mandate. Yeah, it's not piracy. Yeah, that's war risk. And we've been lobbying the UK government for the last 7 years to change and update that, and it hasn't moved an inch.
Any observations as to why you think it might not have moved?
I think it's that noise. It's in a too difficult bucket,
and that noise is interesting. Sorry, just to stop you there, because that is one of the frequent criticisms I get from government is you speak. There's too many voices coming. So it's a good segue into Charlotte here. There's too many voices coming through really to get the sort of clarity. And I'm not saying you don't put your case in a particularly normal, articulate way, but it is a challenge.
There's also that out of sight thing we talked about. Shipping really is out of sight. Yes, you click for your Amazon stuff and it turns up, but people don't see the supply chain and they don't see, quite frankly, the bodies floating in the water that have been happening in the Red Sea. And I think there's an element of a lack of reporting on it and a lack of the kind of understanding of the human impact as much as anything, which means you haven't got that clamour to really change things and that consensus that pulls through.
And it is fascinating, isn't it? It's out of sight because we always deliver. We always deliver. The gas comes to France. I won't say where from. The gas comes from France still.
It does.
And the oil comes to the petrol stations, and the food comes to the farmers, or for the fertilizer. It always, despite all the problems we get, we all seem to deliver, and that removes the sense of crisis, maybe.
And maybe that's the sort of positive story. Shipping does find a way. I think again, this Union, which is the vessel at the top there with the Houthis, doing a very good marketing campaign of what they were doing there. There's 1 million barrels of oil in that tanker, and we were running the project to go down there. She burnt for nearly 3.5 weeks before we reached her, and got her out of there.
Did DD thank you?
No, they didn't actually. Funny enough, but what was interesting is we had a team of people dedicated to liaison with government throughout that, which we had to try and pull on the resources we needed to get such an unusual operation conducted, and we got immense support from particularly the US and UK government and a few others. But what was interesting is most of the government resources you would imagine would be there for such an enormous scenario. And that's 4 times the oil of Exxon Valdez in terms of the volume of oil that was about to spill into the Red Sea. 35 million people in the Red Sea dependent on desalination.
Yeah.
You name it. If you like diving, some great spots. That she was in the middle of that, burning away for nearly 4 weeks. We couldn't get a lot of the oil spill response assets that sit at government level because she hadn't yet broken up and spilt. So there we were trying to get to her as fast as we could.
You wanted to use a sanctioned tug as well, didn't you?
We did get OFAC to clear 2 tugs in 24 hours. Yeah,
that's why we covered you, John.
We're going. There's some good news stories, but it was astonishing how much time it took to and how much we were briefing. How little was coming back. At times. So
there was a crisis. This is a good place to turn to you, Charlotte. So it's not just about the UK. It's obviously how governments across the world work with partner nations, really. To go about updating the rules to deliver solutions. So I think one thing that came out of John's little, vignette there about the Syrian was, it was a lot of jurisdictions involved. There were the Gulf states because they rely on the water. There was, I don't know, the Saudis. There's some quite colourful language in Julian's paper there explaining all the sort of things that were going on. But there are a lot of people you need to sort of corral together. So what is the role of government when you have these crises that actually, cross a number of different boundaries? How do you, it must be slow. Can it go faster? Somebody talking about building consensus. I'm just really interested in some perspective, really, about your own experience and how it might go better. For the perhaps not the crises, the sorts of things that you're looking at in core power in terms of trying to build consensus?
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for your question. I'm going to answer a slightly different one. But it's related.
It was a good question then, wasn't it?
It was a good question. It's a good question. But it is related. Don't worry, but it's all fine. But firstly to Yana, I feel your pain about fuels, okay? Can I just say nuclear, okay? And you'll be fine. Okay? Absolutely fine. No more slow steaming. It's going to be fine. It's going to be absolutely fine. But it is, we are talking about the international rules-based order. How do we, continue it? And how do we make sure that that it delivers what we need it to? And Mike, if I can paraphrase you, I think you said that shipping believes in the IMO. It's not a god. It's not something that has to be believed in. It is literally a collection of governments. That's all it is. Now, we know that the IMO is more political than any parliament in the world. It is hugely political. This is a very difficult place in which to get consensus. And in my view, the IMO will be able to continue the important work that it does, provided it doesn't impede progress. And in my view, quite a lot of things are getting more and more gummed up. Now, I'm going to disagree with Chatham House now. This is not going to go well, but I'm going to give it a go. So, Samir said it's technocratic and therefore it's good. I beg to differ. Now, it is important that, you are involved in the theatre of action that is this regulation setting. So to give you a really boring example, okay, the thing that my colleague Uni on the front row here and I talk about more often than we would like is Article 491 and the 1981 Safety Code for Nuclear Ships. 1981. The great Margaret was Prime Minister then. This thing is so old, it's written on vellum. So we have to update that. We have to update that so that we can finish the designs of the reactors that we're going to put on vessels. When are we going to have an update of that? 7 years? 9 years? All right, what do we do now? Twiddle our thumbs? So we are entering a world where it's going to be quite difficult. And so what nations need to do, and indeed what the shipping industry needs to do, what everyone needs to do, you don't just put up a flag and say, this is what I want. You have to put forward the so what. And as a minister, I didn't hear enough of the so what. And in the IMO, sometimes you don't hear enough of the so what. It's just lots of people saying, I want this, I want that. And I'm just going to do a really quick aside, because this is one of the reasons why I disagree with Chatham House, in that these organizations do not need to exist. And it is about the nations that are members of them that need to take responsibility for that. I take you back to COP 20-something or other, don't remember which one. There I was in Sharm el-Sheikh on a panel with a minister from another country. And I'm not going to say which one because I get in trouble. And he was so proud. They just had a whole wodge of money, international climate funding, a whole wodge of money. He was really, really excited. You know what he was going to do with it? He was going to build some roads. Build some roads with the climate funding. Not for electric vehicles, just for normal ones. And I was like, this is not going to end well. And we're talking about the billions and billions of pounds the levy is supposed to collect at the IMO. And you have stories like that. And you wonder why people might be just a little bit dubious as to where that money is going to go and how we're going to agree where that money is going to go. And then it will all just get gummed up. And then nothing will happen. And progress will be stopped. And then what will happen? We will revert to bilateral and multilateral agreements. Do I want that to all happen? No. Do I think it might? Absolutely. What can you guys do about it? Now, Yana said that shipping is fragmented. Yeah, it is. It's also competitive. That is literally why it is fragmented. It's because it's highly competitive. The people who are going to win in all of this are those that are the most agile.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Quite a challenge to all of us, I think. Right, we're coming to the end. I'm going to sort of finish by asking the panel very quickly just to say really maybe one thing, maybe two. How do we go faster? And then don't put your book away just yet. There's a question for the audience as well before we wrap up. So maybe Charlotte, we'll start with you. You're very much looking at how we go faster at the moment. Can any one thing for the ship owners, the policymakers, everybody in this room, really, how do we go faster? What will your
do the hard work before you have the conversation. Do the work. What do you want? Really go into the detail. Commit resources to it, and then go and have the conversation. Don't just turn up and whinge.
Excellent. That is a really good piece of advice. Ioanna,
What I want to
keep it below 10, okay?
Sorry?
Keep it below 10.
What I think is important is efficiencies, what we can do today, because rather than focusing on like the long-term plans, is, as they say, is the best fuel is the fuel you don't burn, because energy is going to be scarce anyway. So there are many low-hanging fruits that we can use today, and I think IMO and the policymakers should focus on what we're doing today, because all of the CO2 is still going into the atmosphere with no repercussions, nothing that is coming out. So you can focus on operational efficiencies. New ships today, even with conventional fuel, are 30% more efficient than 15 years ago.
Greeks, the world's greatest pragmatists, just go slower, build more efficient ships, and you will stop polluting the atmosphere by 30%.
I think so.
Yeah, absolutely, really good. Samir.
Yeah, I don't actually entirely disagree with you in the sense that there are subsets of countries, maybe bilaterally and others, that may actually come up with solutions. That is actually one way of going being more agile. But I'd certainly say I think there's a premium for being agile and finding unique ways around all of this. You may not bring everyone globally on board, but I think the power of example of finding agile ways to move forward, whether it's a particular route or a particular subset of countries or connections between particular ports, may actually then prove to be quite an interesting example to others. So I don't think we're going to necessarily get the world moving at the same time in the same direction. That has gone, as all the reasons mentioned before. But I think this premium on agility and unique combinations of actors, countries, ports, shipping companies, whatever that combination might be, may actually be an interesting way forward.
So be prepared, be agile, be pragmatic. John,
be informed. You can be agile if you know what's going on. Yeah, I think I talked earlier about noise. There's a lot out there. You've got to be very selective about where you get your information from, and you've got to have your analysis at a very high quality level, and it's got to be in real time.
Yeah. And
if you've got that, you've got the ultimate ability to make a decision and go. Union was 1,000 different problems solved over the space of about 6 or 8 weeks. Every day, a chess piece would come off the board because the opportunity to do something would go. The time was limited. It was that kind of compressing timeline. And it's the same whether you're doing a routine voyage and there's an incident 100 miles in front and you've got that window of time where you can avoid it and go around it, or you're going to sail straight into it. And I think shipping is built around, great things like the charter party, but effectively they lock in a series of things at a period of time, and then something else happens now 2 weeks later along that chosen route, and the charter party doesn't account for it.
Yeah.
And then you get these huge disputes, which many people in this room will be involved with, of deviation and other things. So it's out there. The technology's there to get the information in real time, and you'll be informed.
I thought that was probably the best piece of a set of advice I've had for a long, long time. So please, just jump on, do your Slido poll. I just want to see, just remember, as I think I said the last time I did this, that my bonus depends upon the feel-good factor at the end of this. But no, I'm joking, obviously. I'm just genuinely interested in whether you feel that has been a useful conversation to have, because it's certainly one that I'm very interested in. So about the same, less positive, more positive. Oh gosh, I'm going to be very poor next year. So make people more miserable. Excellent. Right. Okay. Well, I'm going to flip this. I think we now, whether you're from government, industry, a think tank, whatever it is, you now understand the scale of the challenge that we face if we're going to sort of take on the problems that we all face. Whether you're British, American, Chinese, Indian, Iranian, whatever we are. It's we're all human beings. Please join me. Give a fantastic round of applause to the panel. Thank you very, very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your day and facing the challenges that we all got. Thank you very much. Thank you.